A commercial pilot cruising at 35,000 feet sees something outside his window that doesn't match anything in his training. He files no public report. He tells no journalist. Not because it didn't happen, but because he signed something that makes silence the professional choice. The people with the most direct observational access to the sky are the ones least permitted to tell you what's in it. The silence the pilot in that hook chose wasn't personal caution. It was engineered. And the engineering is more specific than most people realize. Start with the FAA's own reporting framework. The Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS, is the mechanism the agency points to when it wants to demonstrate that pilots have a channel for unusual observations. File a report, receive immunity from certain FAA enforcement actions. That sounds like protection. What it actually is an internal valve. The immunity it offers covers disciplinary action within the FAA's own enforcement structure. It does not protect a pilot from their airline. It does not protect them from the terms of their employment contract. And it does not constitute any form of public disclosure. The report goes into a database managed by NASA. It stays anonymous. It stays internal. The pilot who used it has not told you anything. That distinction between what you can file quietly and what you can say out loud is the load-bearing beam of this entire architecture. Airlines add the next layer. Standard employment agreements at major carriers include confidentiality provisions that cover in-flight observations, incident reports, and communications with air traffic control. The stated rationale is liability management. Don't let a crew member's informal account of a rough approach become a plaintiff's exhibit in a lawsuit. That framing is reasonable, and it deserves a fair hearing. Liability law is genuinely complex, and airlines genuinely do face litigation risk from public statements made by employees. But here is where the framing breaks down. Those clauses are not written narrowly around liability-adjacent events. They are written broadly enough to cover categories of observation that have no conceivable connection to a slip-and-fall settlement. The asymmetry is the tell. A pilot who files an internal report about an unexplained object at 40,000 feet is protected. The same pilot who describes that object to a journalist is not. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, extends this logic globally. Its standards and recommended practices create a parallel framework across non-US carriers that mirrors the same internal versus public split. Different countries, different regulators, same architecture. A commercial pilot flying out of Frankfurt or Singapore or São Paulo operates under a reporting culture that is structurally identical in one specific way. Internal disclosure is managed. Public disclosure is not. Ryan Graves understood this from the inside. A former Navy FA-18F pilot and aviation safety advocate, Graves became the first former active-duty pilot to come forward publicly about regular UAP sightings in controlled airspace, and later testified before Congress about them. His 2023 testimony before the House Oversight Subcommittee on National Security, the Border, and Foreign Affairs revealed not just what pilots were seeing, it was the pressure system surrounding what they were allowed to say about it. Commercial aircrew who witnessed UAP had no protections against retaliation and were hesitant to discuss anything unusual on the radio with air traffic control or in any official company forum. When his own squadron submitted a safety report after a documented incident, there was no official acknowledgement and no further mechanism to report sightings. The report existed. The silence around it was enforced. Graves told the committee that incidents in American airspace were grossly underreported, that the stigma attached to UAP was real and powerful, and that the government knows more about UAP than is shared publicly. That last part is worth sitting with. Not a fringe blogger. A former Navy pilot under oath before the House Oversight Subcommittee on National Security, the Border, and Foreign Affairs. So here is the question. If the official explanation for all of this is liability management and airspace security, does that explanation account for the specificity of what gets covered? Liability law doesn't require silencing a pilot about an object that never came close to the aircraft. Airspace security doesn't require that the same categories of observation be suppressed under FAA frameworks, airline NDAs, and ICAO standards simultaneously, across jurisdictions, with no coordination anyone will publicly acknowledge. These aren't isolated policy quirks that happen to overlap. They form a consistent architecture. And consistent architectures are built by someone for a reason. Because the next part isn't about what the rules say. It's about what the rules are protecting. Ryan Graves testified under oath that commercial pilots won't even mention unusual objects on the radio. Does that sound like a liability policy to you, or something else? Drop your answer in the comments below. Because the next question isn't what the rules prohibit, it's who wrote them and what they're built to protect. The categories of observation most tightly controlled under these frameworks: unexplained aerial phenomena at altitude, anomalies near restricted military airspace, high-altitude objects that don't appear on air traffic control radar, are precisely the categories where multiple institutional interests converge simultaneously. Defense contractors operating classified test programs, military black budget projects using commercial airspace corridors without filing public flight plans, intelligence community assets that, by definition, cannot acknowledge their own presence. Each of those interests has a specific, concrete reason to want a commercial pilot's observation to stay internal. None of them are served by that pilot talking to a journalist. All of them are served by the architecture we already described. That's the revealed preference argument. Not what the rules claim to protect, but who actually benefits when they work as designed. Liability law protects airlines. The FAA's internal valve protects the FAA's enforcement record. But when you map the specific categories of suppressed observation against the specific institutional actors who operate in those exact categories of airspace, the beneficiary list shifts noticeably away from the people the rules nominally exist to serve. Some people hear this and immediately reach for the most extreme interpretation. Flat Earth adherents have used pilot silence as supposed evidence that commercial crews are hiding a curved horizon. Chemtrail theorists treat NDA clauses as proof that aircrew are complicit in atmospheric spraying programs. Those readings don't hold. They require pilots to be active participants in a deception rather than employees operating under standard contractual pressure. And they collapse under the weight of the actual documents, which are mundane employment agreements, not conspiracy instruments. That fringe overclaim is worth naming cleanly, because it is the thing that lets the institutional architecture stay invisible. If the only people asking questions about pilot silence are the people also claiming the Earth is a disk, then no serious journalist ever has to answer the question. The serious question is narrower and more uncomfortable. NASA's own ASRS program, the government's voluntary reporting system for aviation safety, requires that pilots who use it stay completely anonymous to participate. The identity strip is time-stamped by NASA, may be used to follow up with the reporter, and is then returned to the reporter, not retained in ASRS files. The data stays inside a closed system. That is the government's own preferred mechanism for handling what pilots see. And the government built it to be confidential by design. That's not a conspiracy. That's a documented structural choice. The fact that even the official government channel requires anonymity to function should tell you something about what happens to pilots who don't stay anonymous. I'm not saying pilots are sitting on proof of something extraordinary. I want to be precise about that. What I'm saying is that the architecture of silence is too specifically targeted at too specific a category of observation to be explained entirely by liability law. Liability law doesn't require the same categories of observation to be suppressed under FAA frameworks, airline employment agreements, and NASA's own reporting infrastructure simultaneously, across jurisdictions, with no public coordination anyone will acknowledge. That's not redundancy. Redundant systems protect against failure. This architecture protects against disclosure. Come back to where this started. The pilot at 35,000 feet. The thing outside the window. The silence that followed. The rules don't tell you what he saw, but they tell you, with considerable precision, exactly what category of observation triggered them. And that specificity is its own kind of answer. The rules tell you exactly what someone decided you shouldn't know. They just don't tell you why. And in 2 decades of documented pilot testimony, congressional hearings, and voluntary reporting systems built around anonymity, nobody in a position to answer that question has been required to. Subscribe if that silence bothers you as much as it should, and watch the next video to find out who actually controls the airspace above you.